You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Andrew McMillion. Andrew lives on a 4-acre organic farm in Ornes, Norway, where he grows 200 varieties of vegetables, trees, and herbs. The theme or mission of Andrew's farm is to increase and protect biodiversity by growing and improving rare cultivars and heirloom varieties. And he does this in cooperation with the Norwegian seed savers, which we'll hear about in this show. And Andrew's work also focuses on improving the resilience of local communities to enable them to better cope with the effects of climate change. Welcome to Sustainable World Radio, Andrew. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Jill. It's a real honor.
And so right now, are you on location at your farm?
Actually, I'm at my mom's farm, not far away. I needed to get away from my son, otherwise I wouldn't get any peace here.
Well, let's pretend you're at your farm. Can you describe to listeners what it's like there and what climate you're in so they know where you are in the world?
Right. So we're about an hour north of the capital of Norway, Oslo, and it's inland. So we have the Gulf Stream in Norway, which warms things up a bit if you compare it to the same distance north in Canada or the United States, but it gets to be quite cold in the winter. We have about 2 or 3 weeks where it can get below minus 20 to even 30 Celsius. There are most plants just won't survive. So one of the things that we've been working on is finding which plants we can put on the farm that will survive the winter. So very hardy perennials. Our farm is about 4 acres, and most of it is just clover for sheep. And then just this year, we managed to set up a 300 square meter polytunnel, which was a reclaimed, you could say, polytunnel. And that's been a huge change for us. That's a milestone. And so this year, we've been able to grow about 150 different varieties in there, mostly annuals, but I'm also focusing on herbs and building up the stock of hardy perennials in there.
When listeners hear about the variety of plants you have growing, I think they're going to be amazed.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been an uphill curve, I should say. It's grown quite quickly from just 5 years ago, when I only had maybe 5 or 6 different types of plants, and I wasn't succeeding with any of them. I really didn't understand what I was doing wrong, but nothing was working. And then just slowly learning more and more about it and focusing more and more on soil health. Actually, that's been, I'd say, one of the big keys, which I learned a lot about from listening to your show. You really need to be interacting with the soil first and understanding the soil that they're in, if you want to communicate properly with the plants, or you want them to thrive. So that's been, this year really we've seen a big change in the quality of the soil. Started building, I've added a bunch of compost and started trying to understand how nutrients cycle, and it's just been amazing to see the difference. I mean, now when I look in the dirt now and in the soil, it's just full of worms, and you can see the difference in the health of the plants. Just it's like 2 totally different farms from last year and this year.
Oh, that's good news. And when we first started talking about this interview, you were telling me about how it was not that long ago, but you've totally changed your life, and you weren't really thinking about soil and plants in 2006. So
Absolutely not.
So what sparked your decision to work with plants and move in this direction? Tell us what you were doing and where you were and what happened.
Okay, so 10 years ago in 2006, I was in Austin, Texas, working for Apple Computers. And I was living what, a lot of people in the rest of the world would consider to be the American dream, a car, driving to work and working for a big famous company and all the excitement that you could imagine would go along with that sort of a lifestyle. but I was totally miserable, really miserable, stuck in traffic, going to work and back, putting on weight, eating out way too much. And I was listening to Democracy Now! A lot, and then I started to hear about the Green Party, and I started to pay more and more attention to carbon and global warming. And I took a test on a carbon calculator, and I realized my footprint was, 16 tons a year, which is, your average American carbon footprint. And it was the first time when I realized that there was a connection between what I was doing and global warming. I'd always thought this is sort of a global problem. I hadn't realized that, well, it's the sum of all the actions of all the people on the planet that was causing this. Therefore, I was a part of the problem. And then in the beginning, I just suffered from all the usual things that everybody else suffers from when they realize that, the cognitive dissonance, where you realize that you're doing something that's bad for your health, bad for the health of your environment, but you don't know what to do to change it. So you sort of just live with this opposition of sort of inability to make changes. And then I also started suffering from something called pre-traumatic stress disorder, where you know that the effects of climate change are coming, and that your lifestyle is contributing to it, and you just feel like a certain urge to do something about it. But again, it just builds anxiety and guilt because you don't know what to do. But at one point, I finally said, okay, look, I just have to do something. I have to change my life drastically. I just felt a sudden sense of urgency to do something. And I figured, well, I have to just leave the States because nothing, my life here is just not working. And, I was originally, my mother's from Norway, so I figured, okay, I'll move back to Norway. And the first summer, I just lived in a sailboat, and I went climbing and spent time in nature, and it was amazing. I just was totally renewed. I realized how little I actually needed to have a good life, and that all the things that I was working for and expecting and hoping for really weren't actually giving me anything. But, you can't just suddenly change. And if you just take yourself out of a situation like that and put yourself into a better situation, you still have all the habits and you have all the mental patterns of years of being, in a certain mindset that you can't just get rid of. And what I realized after a while is that it takes time. I started reading Ornes, an eco-philosopher. He's the father of the deep ecology movement. He has these sort of principles about the world and about how all life has value in itself, that it's not humans who are sort of the measure of things, and that we are actually deeply connected to all life. And he calls it the eco-self, which he sort of contrasts to the ego self, which is what our society values above everything else. He says, it's not about trying to control life. It's about understanding how we're connected to, and also changing our perception. He calls it something called a Gestalt switch. It's when you look at the same, if sometimes you can see a picture, you've probably seen it, where you look at it from one angle and it looks like a duck, and you look at it from another angle and it looks like a rabbit. That's a Gestalt switch, but you can do that with your whole perspective of life as well, where everything changes. And Ornes was talking about how we need to do that. We need to change our perspective of reality to look at ourselves not as individuals in a snap of time all alone, where we live and die within our own bodies, but as something that bears a long connection back to the beginning of life 500 million years ago, and that we have in us the potential to continue that life moving forward. But yeah, so those types of mental changes started happening with me, and I started thinking about increasing life quality, which is another one of the concepts that Ornes talks about, which really has to do with slowing down and just enjoying the place where you are and small things. And I felt like, wow, this is amazing. I really want to be a part of that change. So I started to try and get in contact with other people who had the same sort of mindset through the Green Party and other environmental movements, and just slowly started moving in the right direction. But there's so much that needs to be done, and there's so many choices that we as society have made for the last 150 years in an unsustainable direction, that you cannot expect to suddenly flip the switch and be in a sustainable life. You have to work on it step by step. And so that's what I finally realized is, okay, what I do is I'll I started being scientific about it. Well, okay, I'll go and I'll calculate my carbon footprint and I'll work on the worst things first. So I realized that you have to think about how you live, what kind of building you live in, how you transport yourself around, and what you eat. Those are like the three cornerstones of getting to grips with your carbon footprint. So I got we got an electric car, and we moved out to the countryside when our son was born in 2009. And I was really eager to get going and start growing my own vegetables. I had no idea what I was doing. I really didn't. I mean, I didn't know anything about. And I talked to somebody and I said, where should I start? Somebody who knew what she was doing. And she said, start with something easy, And she gave me chives and beans and cucumbers. And I was like, wow. So I tried that. And of course, the cucumbers didn't even make it through April. I mean, but the chives are still alive. The chives that she gave me, I still have. So yeah.
You'll always have a special place in your heart for chives.
I will, and it's one of the seeds that I've saved the longest. I've had 5 generations of seeds of chives and given loads of chive seeds. In fact, I can't give away enough chive seeds. I have loads of the stuff.
So, Andrew, you went from knowing nothing about plants to now saying that you believe that connectedness to plants is a large part of the solution to the challenges that face us. Can you explain that to listeners?
Absolutely. It's on many different levels, to be honest, and it's something that kind of sneaks on you. It's not something you experience right away. And in fact, there are days when I don't feel it at all. But then there are other days, like I can start by giving you the peak moment for me was when I was in my greenhouse in August, and I had just finished watering the greenhouse, and suddenly I just could feel. It wasn't just that I saw all the abundance in my greenhouse, but I could sense all the roots going down underneath the ground, and I just felt like they were all thanking me. It was a really weird feeling, or like sitting under my apple tree on a nice warm day in the summer, and just thinking about all the times that I cycled around the farm with a wheelbarrow and moved from the trees to the bushes to the greenhouse, all those cycles, and all the plants that are reacting to all of the work that I've done with them, in harmony with them. And that's sort of the peak that I felt this year. But it started much more simply. It started really with oak trees, actually. I mean, I heard a podcast on Sustainable World Radio, actually, by Byron Joel, and I realized, wow, I didn't realize oak was such a powerful plant. And so my son and I, this is 2014, we went to a nearby a school here that has a big oak orchard, and we collected acorns. We collected about 30 acorns in the fall, and then I did a little bit of research on it to find out, how does this work? And I realized that you had to stratify them, so I did that, and then I planted them in the windows, in pots, and then took care of them, and then I planted 10 of them, which I was hoping to eventually be windbreaks on the northern edge of the farm. Of course, after a while, I realized, yes, and someday that's what they'll be. But now they'll just remain real small, for quite some time. They don't go very quickly. But yeah, I just love looking at them and caring for them and watching them grow. And it's a beautiful plant, because even from the first moment when it comes up, you can see it's an oak. It's not like some plants when they come up, you can't tell what it is for a while. Right away, the first leaves, it's oak. And then the other thing is you go through cycles with plants. If you've been through, you can't really have a strong connection with a plant, I don't think, unless you've gone through a number of generations. Like one of the other plants that I have built up a really good relationship with is Tree Kale or Tree Collards, which is actually a plant. The plants that I have originally come from California.
I just planted one last night.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Now that's. I mean, in California, it's a given. It makes total sense to have it. And in Norway, it's not as a logical choice. You wouldn't think that Tree Collards, which is a plant that probably evolved in northern Africa or Africa and then moved to the southern states, possibly with slavery, that you would think that a plant like that doesn't tolerate more than a few degrees below freezing would work in Norway. But through the Norwegian Seed Savers, I got in contact with somebody called Stephen Barstow, who wrote a book called Around the World in 80 Plants. And he's sort of like the perennial wizard of northern edible perennials. He's also sort of the central point around the Norwegian Seed Savers. It has been for some years. And he advertised that he had a few cuttings of this purple tree kale or collard, and I said, please, I really would like to be one of the lucky people who gets one of these, and I promised that I would share it. And now 2 years later, I have the original plant that I got from him, which is in my living room right now because it's starting to get cold, and I have 7 of its descendants from last year, all of which I've saved. I should have actually probably not saved them all because they're taking up a lot of space, but I just couldn't. I couldn't kill them. Like, no, I can't.
Well, aren't they? They get really tall. How tall are they?
They do. They're about as tall as I am now, getting close to 2 meters. And then I have another 40 from this year, so I have 3 generations now, and I've shared at least 60 cuttings because they don't go to seed very often. It's one of those plants that only goes to seed when it's stressed. I was actually this year able to save seeds from it. But in any case, the point is that it's a plant that actually needs our help, so to speak. It wouldn't make it this far north on its own yet. With global warming, who knows? In my lifetime, I could see a purple tree collard that's adapted itself to our soil, which is actually something that I'm working on together with the Experimental Farm Network. Is trying to cross purple tree kale with other types of hardy perennial kales so that we can get a kale that's tall and hardy and purple, and to continue to add and take care of the genetic diversity of these plants and to help them adapt to the changes that are coming. So yeah, those are some of the plants. There's a lot more.
I think connecting with plants and being in relationship with them really puts you into a different life rhythm. Don't you agree?
It totally does. I wouldn't say you're forced to slow down, but I noticed this and I also heard that from somebody else on your radio, so I'm repeating what I heard there. But basically what he was saying was that on a bad day when he's mad, angry, which I get often, get frustrated, on those days, he says, don't go out into your garden. He says, because you're going to do damage. And I learned that too, that it's totally true. If I'm not in a good mood and I go out into my garden, I'm liable to kill a few plants and then regret it afterwards. So it really is. It's not like with human beings. If you yell and scream at a human being and lose your temper, okay, you might hurt the person, but he's not gonna die. But that's not the same necessarily with plants, and they react totally differently. You have to understand their needs. And you have to understand how you relate to them first before they can start relating to you. But they do eventually. So it's something that definitely takes time, but it's absolutely worth it because it changes your whole perspective on life. I mean, our world is so anthropocentric. We're so focused on humanity and human beings, and everything is based on the value of us. But what are we really? We're just connections. There is no I. There's just the connections between your mind and your stomach and the rest of the organs in your body. And then also going out from there. What are you? There's an unbroken heartbeat from your heartbeat going back to the very first heartbeat. Unbroken. Meditating on that side of reality to me gives me a lot more joy than thinking about economics or thinking about material wealth or those types of sides of society.
You say that one of your goals is really to become carbon negative and to keep carbon in the ground. Can you explain that to listeners?
Absolutely. I think like our world is so focused on budgets. No matter where you go, it's private economy, your municipal economy, your company's economy. It's all about keeping your budget balanced, and preferably then to make a margin. With carbon budgets, it's the opposite. You're striving for negativity, and that's not a negative thing. It means that you're keeping less carbon in the atmosphere than there is. And our problem really right now, our main problem on the planet, there's just too much of the stuff, right? We've been pumping it out for the last 150 years plus. So what we need is not just, you hear a lot of people talking about carbon neutral, right? Carbon neutrality, and that's a big word that you hear. Governments are talking about it. I don't understand why they're not talking about carbon negativity. I mean, that should obviously be the goal at the state we're in. We don't have the time to just be carbon neutral. We need to be carbon negative. We need to put the carbon in the ground. And we need to look at the solutions that are there already, right? So Obviously, we need to stop things like deforestation. I mean, there are lots of organizations who are doing that. One of the things that we're doing here in the local municipality, where I'm on the municipal board for representing the Green Party, is we're working with a number of other NGOs and other political parties to try and keep a peat bog from being industrially extracted. There's something like 300,000 tons of carbon in that peat bog here in our municipality. And there's hardly any money to be made on extracting it. And most of it, sadly, is being used in agriculture and in greenhouses. I myself have actually used peat to start plants before I understood how bad it was for the environment. The thing with peat is that it holds all this carbon because it's full of water, so there's no oxygen in it, right? And what you do to extract that is you first drain the bog, and that's what they've done now. They've drained 1/3 of the bog locally, and then they come in with big machines and basically vacuum clean up all the peat, right? So one of my personal goals is to become carbon negative on my own budget. And I wouldn't say I'm there yet, but I've gone from the 16 tons that I was in Texas 10 years ago to about 4 tons, half of which this year was a flight to the States, which I had to do because my grandmother died, so I had to travel for that. You know, you have to actually break it down like you would any other budget and see, well, be mathematical about it. And then the same thing goes for municipalities. Municipalities should also every municipality should not just have an economic budget. Every municipality should have a carbon budget, right? And that's one of the things I've been trying to talk to people about locally, but we're not there yet, sadly. But at least trying to stop them from making it way worse. Just to put that into perspective, I mean, it's 300,000 tons of carbon. That's the same amount of carbon that 150,000 cars would release in a year. You know, an average car releases about 2 tons of carbon a year. So that's like putting 150,000 more cars on the road for a whole year. That's how big that is. It's a huge footprint, and it's a municipality that only has 20,000 people. These types of things, people don't think like this. When I first got into politics, one of the politicians who's been here in politics for 20 years, he came up to me and asked me when I was on a stand, so I don't get it. What does the environment have to do with politics? I was so stunned by that question that I couldn't come up with a good answer. Here I was standing handing out oak trees, baby oak trees, trying to explain to people that if you take this oak and you plant it, when it's a full-grown oak can capture 250 kilos of carbon in a year, right? 1/4 ton a year, a fully mature oak can capture. But then here, this guy who has making a decision for 300,000 tons, and then he asks me, well, I don't get it. That's the state of the disconnect that we're in our society.
And we have to figure out how to bridge that gap where we have at least a minimal degree of ecological literacy for people making decisions. So the peat bog actually is it's an environmental hero that is sucking carbon or holding carbon.
Absolutely. And the same thing goes for trees. Don't underestimate trees. That's why you can't build a peat bog. It takes 10,000 years. That peat bog is 10,000 years old. You get 1 millimeter of peat a year built on that peat bog. That's how slow that process goes. Trees are much quicker. We can reforest. It's a tool we can use.
And is there anything that listeners could do to help with the peat bog fight or defense?
Well, this peat issue is not just an issue in Norway. It's a global issue. There are organizations working to keep peat humid and to keep it as a carbon sink all over the world. So first thing I would say, especially for plant people, and I see so many plant people who are ecological, or what's the word in America? You call it organic growers, but then they use peat. They don't understand it. Peat is, you can have organic peat. Peat is organic. It doesn't make it right? It just, so you even just something like changing the medium in which you're growing your plants can have a huge impact on the environment.
It's true. And I worked at an organic farm years ago, and we used peat with no idea of where that was harvested at that point. That was many years ago.
The problem is really that peat is such an easy medium to use because it's neutral. It doesn't really have any nutrients in it. So you can sort of add exactly the amounts that you want. And also it holds a lot of air, so seeds germinate quite quickly and easily in it. It has both air and water retention, and it's sort of a nice neutral base. To make the change, it's not that easy. I've been testing out a few different options, and including trying to make my own starting soil this year. It's a change that we have to make, but it's definitely worth doing.
One thing I really enjoyed in our correspondence was you saying that you believe that life quality is really found in surrounding yourself with as diverse a group of plants or life as possible. So it's really engaging with life and reverence for life as well.
It is, absolutely, and then you also understand, that ecological health is really boils down to how much of life are you connected to. And in our world, we are not aware of we're all just as connected to life. I mean, there's not a greater or lesser degree, but there's a greater or lesser degree of awareness of connected to life, and that, I think, is the real pivot here. You can walk around and go to the store and buy everything you need and have no concept of where it's coming from or what it took for that life to become a part of you. But when you're out there and you're interacting with life, then life becomes more precious. It becomes more sacred, for lack of a better word. I mean, for some people that might not be an easy thing to swallow, but for me, life is sacred. It's not something that you just waste, and our society has become so wasteful. And I think that's the symptom of our time, is just a mindless consumption instead of a connectedness. And that's the thing with our biodiversity disappearing. Why is it disappearing so quickly? It's disappearing because we're not connected to it. We don't value it anymore. We don't see its point. We're just looking at the material itself instead of the connections. And I think that's the shift that needs to happen. We have to realize that we are not living in a material world. We're living in a connected world. A world, that's what really defines humans. It was when we started to connect and work together that we evolved as a species. And also, not just when we connected to each other, but when we started to connect to plants, and we started to understand that you could save the seeds of plants. All the cultivars, the history of the cultivars on this planet, that is the history of humans connecting with plants and realizing that you can save and you can interact generation after generation with plants, and then collecting the best ones, passing them on to your children, and then them and the knowledge for how to interact with them, and then to continue that generation after generation after generation. And some of these plants, cucumbers, have been with us for 7,000 years or more. Legumes, beans, and peas have been with us for 20,000 years maybe. And then there's the wild plants. One of the plants that I've come to really connect with is called Habblizia, or the Caucasus spinach. And it's found in the Caucasus in caves that very likely had our ancestors 50,000 years lived in. So very likely we've been interacting with Caucasus spinach for 50,000 years. Not as a plant that we consciously saved seeds from, but as a plant that we ate because it was in our environment. And it came up really early. It comes up before the snow melts in Norway. So it's the first plant that I eat, and it's such a joy to be able to go out. Snow hasn't melted, and there are these little shoots. And it's a plant that you can grow all year. It's also one of the last things that I harvest because it's so hardy.
What's the Latin name of that plant?
It's Habblizia tamnoides, also known as the Caucasus spinach.
Wow. And so tell us a bit, let's start talking a bit about some of your favorite plants that you grow, because I know you're growing over, I think, 200 varieties.
Right. So,
tell us about some of your favorites, and we could start with this one. How do you grow this plant?
Habblizia is a plant that's really easy to grow. I mean, it's a little bit tricky to get started because it needs about 1 week of cold stratification to get it going, and the seeds are really, really small. In fact, that's one of the things that I'd like to begin with Habblizia as a seed, because the seed is, there's one seed at the center of a really small flower, and there's thousands of flowers on each plant. And those little tiny flowers, they blow in the wind, and since they're like a wheel, they just tumble across the ice or the snow, so they can just spread really far with the wind, right?
Wow.
And that, the nice thing about that is that when you have it on your plant and on your farm, if you're careful, you might suddenly find it popping up somewhere else on your farm, right? Which is a great thing. If that happens, just save it. It's not invasive because you can eat it, and it's really healthy for you.
What a great image of a plant, actually the flower tumbling across the snow. I mean, how could a seed survive? Gorgeous. That's amazing.
It is really amazing, and it's one of those things, every year I save seeds from Habblizia, and it's just as amazing every time to just get down. You almost need a microscope or a looking glass to see them. And they're just these little tiny black shiny seeds. They're gorgeous.
Are they like carrot-sized seeds or
No, well,
a
even
little
they're
bigger?
round, right?
Uh-huh.
They're even smaller than carrots. I mean,
Oh.
it's really really small, spherical though. Yeah, gorgeous plant. In the beginning, it's a little bit tricky to get it started from seed, but the other nice thing about it is that you can also split them, right? So you can cut the roots up. So you from one plant you can easily get 10 plants in a year, and they also send out side shoots. So, the roots go out laterally so that you can get many more plants that way as well. And it's a climbing plant, so it's a really good plant if you're into food forest gardens because you can plant it. You don't want to plant it under, I made the mistake of planting it under the apple tree, and it's just too dry under the apple tree. But you can plant it under any kind of small fruit trees that are establishing themselves, and they love them because they'll climb up the apple trees or we have cherry trees, and they do well with cherry trees.
And you cook this plant, I assume, like most.
You can eat it in a salad.
Mhm.
You can eat it fresh. You can use it like a spinach. I mean, its nickname is the Caucasus Spinach, and it's very mild. It's not like some people don't like even spinach. Some people don't like, but it's quite it's quite mild. So yeah, and as it gets more mature, like it is with most plants. It's best when it's young. But the nice thing, it's one of those cut and come again plants. So before the snow melts, you get the first harvest of the little shoots, and then you can harvest them 2 or 3 times that way when they're 5 to 10 centimeters, even 15 centimeters long. And then you let them grow into mature plants, and then you harvest them again when they're full of seeds. And then you'll see they'll even come again after that before the snow comes. So yeah, they're really amazing plants.
That is fascinating. And I know you're also working with the Experimental Farm Network and doing some perennial kale projects. Can you tell us about those plants? And is that the tree
Yeah.
collard you were talking about earlier or different?
That is a cross between the tree collard and Dalbidon kale. There was in 2011 there was a farm in Wales. I forget the name of the farmer right now, but she noticed that her tree collards were going to seed at the same time as the Dalbidon, which is also a perennial kale that doesn't go to seed. Both of these plants don't go to seed very frequently, but in her case, they both went to seed the same time, right? And then she saved seeds saved those plants, of course, and then saved seeds from them and started sharing them with the Experimental Farm Network. And now through the Experimental Farm Network, there are lots of different farms all around the States and other places in the world that are now trying to grow this plant and pay attention to the different varieties that it puts up. So I have about 30 plants this year, and because I'm so far north, I have to be kind of strategic about playing with it. So what I do is I have about 5 or 6 plants that I put in my root cellar, which are guaranteed to make it through the winter. Most of the plants I have now moved into the greenhouse, and then I have some plants outdoors. But my experience so far is that most of the kale that is outdoors dies. However, I've also been working on a project with something called the Shetland Kale, which is another cultivar that has been around for at least 400 years or around there, about 400 years in Shetland. And back in the days, most of the farmers on the Shetland Islands, which are some islands between Scotland and Norway that have been both Norwegian and Scottish islands that are now part of Scotland, there were up to 50, 60 farms growing them only 50 years ago, and now there's about 10. It's in danger of disappearing. Since my last name is Scottish and then I'm Norwegian, so I thought, wow, this plant kind of spoke to me in a way before I'd even seen it. So I contacted the Scottish government and asked if I could get some seeds, and they sent me seeds from 5 different farms. And then this year I managed to, most of them died, just the 7 that I had in the basement survived. And so, but this year I was able to save a bunch of seeds from them, and I've been sharing those through the Seed Savers, Norwegian Seed Savers. And I've been doing a little bit more research. A lady on the West Coast who's been growing them for years. So they definitely work on the Norwegian West Coast, where it's quite a bit warmer because the Gulf Stream gives a similar type of climate that you have in Shetland, you would have along the Norwegian coast. So it's definitely a plant that will do well in Norway, and hopefully we'll be able to keep working with it to get used to different conditions around Norway. But it's a kind of plant that makes perfect sense, right? Because it was a few hundred kilometers or a few hundred kilometers south of where we are now, and with global warming, that means we're looking at temperatures and the kind of climate that's similar.
So these kales, it's so interesting to have perennial kale. Tell us a bit about why perennials are such important plants to grow.
Well, the thing about perennials really is that, you don't have to plant them again every year, right? And they're plants that then, since they're not, don't have to be planted again every year, they can adapt to the conditions in the place where they've been planted. And that means that you have plants that are building ecosystems that don't need human intervention to the same extent that annuals do. On my farm, I do both because I don't feel like I haven't done enough work with perennials to just focus on perennials, although the long-term aim is definitely to build up the perennial stock. But now that I have the greenhouse, I'm also going in the direction of playing with a lot of different annuals, and I'm even bringing in cucumber. It's from New Mexico, which this year is the first year I did that. I grew something called Apache Giant and a Navajo Hubbard, a few different plants that I got from the Native Seed Search, which are fairly rare squash, winter squash, and it's amazing what you can do with just a little bit of wind protection and a little bit more heat. We were able to grow watermelons, and the watermelons taste just amazing. And I was like totally shocked. I couldn't believe it. Like watermelons in Norway, and they taste great, and they don't take much space. I was surprised. I think I used 6 square meters. I got 22 watermelons out of 6 square meters. The beans too. Like I mean, of course, like how can you grow beans in a greenhouse? But we had beans that were 7-8 meters long and just produced hundreds of beans on one plant. Chilies, we were able to grow loads. We grow like 12. I counted approximately 1,200 chilies. And those were also, we've taken them and putting them into the basement so that we have them for next year. We don't have to grow those from seeds. So yeah, loads of different interesting plants. One of the plants, or some of the focus that I've had this year is also on Syrian plants. And that's because of the working with something called the Refugee Green Space Initiative. I guess I could say a few words about that.
I was going to ask you about that. So tell us a bit about that. That sounds like such a worthy organization.
It's amazing. It just sort of happened like really quickly in the end of last year. I was invited because I've been thinking about what we could do for all these refugees that are coming to Europe and to Norway. Last year we had a huge amount of refugees from Syria come, and I just felt like these people are traumatized. And a lot of people don't realize that with global warming we're going to see a doubling of refugees over the next 10 years, and it's not going to be people who are dying to get here for economic reasons. It's people who are fleeing global warming. We're talking about something like the estimate is currently something like 30 million climate refugees in the next 10, 12 years. So I started thinking about it. We have to take consequences for what we're doing. So I was invited to this gathering of this people to sort of brainstorm what we could do, and out of that came this Refugee Green Space Initiative, where we started setting up kitchen gardens at refugee centers, basically to try and help, especially youth, by setting up gardens for them. And it's been really an amazing experience. I mean, just this year we had set up gardens in about 12, 13 different refugee centers, and we're hoping to double that by next year. So it's a really great feeling. And we've thought too that it'd be nice for them to have plants that they're familiar with. So I started asking looking around for Syrian vegetables, and we found one called Syrian medieval chard, which is an amazing plant. It's from the Roughwood seed collection. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yes, I've heard him speak. Yeah. He's amazing.
Right. That plant is amazing. I mean, really produces a huge amount, and I saved thousands of seeds from just 7 plants, spreading that all over the place. And then Syrian squash, also from Homs, which is by far our best producer. I got 40 fruit from one plant, and then the last fruit I was able to save seeds from, which is like totally. I mean, for me, is that half of the squash from the season was from that one plant. So it's definitely a plant that I want to keep planting.
Is Refugee Green Space Initiative, you have a website. Can you share it with listeners? And then I think this is an idea that could spread throughout the world.
Absolutely. And it has spread. There are other initiatives like this, in the States. I've seen both in New York and I believe also in California. It's refugeegreenspace.org. It's pretty straightforward.
Because that is such a thoughtful and wonderful way to connect people with the plants of their homeland.
It is. And I think also for somebody like me who's definitely suffered from mental what I call it, stresses due to the changes in my environment. I can only imagine what it's like to have been through not only global warming, which a lot of people are aware of this, but Syria's gone through a drought, and that's part of the dynamic of the whole place. There is that people are struggling, and the same thing is the case in Egypt. People aren't aware of that, but the people are asking for bread in Egypt. So these changes are global, and they're affecting huge populations on our doorsteps. We're just creating these walls to block them out. In the meantime, they're dying because of our greed, the way we're consuming. So it's I think it's something we have to think about. We have to think about our connectedness to other people too, not just to plants, and also the psychological effects. So I think my thing is, at least for me, it's been a big help to psychologically to work with plants, and I'm sure that it's been proven scientifically that it's good for people's psychological states and psychological health to be in the soil and to work with plants. It's a natural de-stressor. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
It does. I love that. So I'll include a link to that organization on this podcast blog post. And so,
Thanks.
Andrew, tell us a bit more about some of your other favorite plants that you're growing.
I would say, actually, I know you've talked a lot about Lambsquarters. A lot of people have talked about Lambsquarters in your podcast, but I'll repeat that plant again, and I'll say that plant is so undervalued by so many people. They just don't understand how awesome that plant is. I save Lambsquarter seeds and I throw them out on my weeded beds. After I weed them, I sprinkle Lambsquarters around on the weeded beds so that I have weeds for next season, because I want those weeds. Those, you can get so many harvests out of the same area when you have Lambsquarters. And for a whole month in June, I eat Lambsquarters every single day.
You're probably really healthy too in June.
Oh, for sure. In fact, I checked that. I checked, what wild plants are the most nutritious plants. And after stinging nettle, which everybody also should eat, and I eat that, in the spring all the time, every day. Lambsquarters comes up second as the second most nutritious wild plant, at least in Norway, that you can eat. So it grows everywhere. I mean, it really, and this year I started branching out, so I don't just have the regular Lambsquarters, but I also have been growing, red Lambsquarters, and there's a Lambsquarters, which I forget the Latin name of, but it's both red and green, gorgeous, just beautiful plants. And then quinoa. A lot of people don't know, but quinoa is actually just a cultivated relative of Lambsquarters. So if you go far enough back, it's pretty much the same thing. And in fact, when you plant them next to each other in the beginning, you really can't tell the difference. It's only when you look at the seed heads when they mature that you can tell the difference. So I was able to get a hold of some Argentinian quinoa, which I grew, and that's another beautiful plant that I've grown. Other plants that I've started getting into are skullcap and valerian, which I also heard about on your show.
That's one of my favorites. It's so relaxing.
Oh, yeah. It really is, and I mix it with different kinds of mint. It's a great plant, and but it's a plant that I still haven't really built the relationship to. So this is the first year that I grew it, and I'm overwintering the roots and hoping that I'll be able to collect seeds from it next year. I kind of feel once you've started collecting seeds from it and you see a couple generations, then you really started to connect properly to it. So it's one of those plants that I'm enjoying consuming and looking forward to understanding better. I also valerian, which I don't react to quite. It's not like every plant that you grow you're going to connect well with. I tried yaccoon this year, which I liked, and I'm definitely going to grow again.
That's one of my favorite plants. I have two in the backyard. One that I do cuttings of it, and it roots so easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the thing that's interesting about it is that it's one of those plants that actually doesn't, the tubers don't really grow before September in Norway, because it needs less than 12 hours of light for them to really develop. And that's one of those things that you don't think about. Like, you see this beautiful plant and you think, wow, it must have great tubers. But we have to work with some of these plants to get them to adapt to the Norwegian conditions. And I think with a greenhouse, after a number of generations, hopefully we'll be able to maybe change that. I don't know. Maybe that's naive to think, but it would be interesting if we could get yaccoon that didn't need 12 hours, but it could grow its tubers a little bit earlier. That's one of the things I'd like to see. Another plant that from South America that I really enjoy is Achocha, or Bolivian cucumber. Ooh. It's a cucumbriate, and it's prolific. I grew it in the same bed as chilies and tomatoes. And the interesting thing about that is that it grows so high. It took over. It grew quickly up to the 5-6 meters long and even longer, and produced hundreds of little cucumbers. And in each cucumber, there are all these gorgeous. It's got the most beautiful seed. It's like it looks like a little spear, like a fat black spear. It's really hard to explain. You have to see it to believe it. It doesn't look like any other seed.
How do you spell that? What's the name of that plant again?
Achocha, Achocha. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. It's a Bolivian cucumber.
I have never heard of that.
Yeah, it's and the thing that's nice about it is it does pretty well in the north. I mean, it's not, we grew it the first year in our kitchen window, and we couldn't see out of our kitchen window. It was just totally green. But then now that we have a greenhouse, I'm definitely growing that again. I also got Bhutanese cucumber, also from the Roughwood Seed Collection, which is called a Gagon cucumber, which is kind of more closely related to melons than cucumbers, but it tastes like cucumbers. And you could eat it when it's like most cucumbers you eat before they're mature, but this one you could eat when it's mature. And one cucumber is just huge. It makes an orange cucumber, and it feels like a meal. You can bring it to a party, and you won't be able to eat one cucumber. It's just ridiculous.
It makes potlucks very easy.
Yeah, it does. And it's impressive. When people come and they see the gaga, they're like, what? Never seen anything that huge hanging off of a plant before.
You must have just many microclimates in your greenhouse to grow all of these plants in Norway.
Actually, no. Actually, I don't. There's just one climate in there and one level of humidity. But I thought about that. I've actually been thinking about how I'm going to be able to create zones in there. And there's all kinds of things I'm looking forward to growing in there, like hardy kiwi, super hardy kiwi, pawpaw. I think there's all kinds of things we could do in there. And I know other people in Sweden who are doing that in greenhouses. So, and I'm talking about unheated greenhouses. Obviously, if you heated it, you could grow hypothetically almost anything.
So you have an unheated greenhouse?
Yeah.
Oh,
it's 300 square meters. So I can't, I could heat it, but I was actually offered the heating unit from when I got it. But I said no, because I don't want to use that much carbon to heat the place. But a friend of mine, Philip Weiss in Sweden, he's like miles ahead of me. He's created a heating bench, which he uses, and then he makes a little tiny little greenhouse on top of the heating bench, and that's just genius, because that it's not in the spring, it's not the light that's the problem. You got plenty of light. It's just the ground hasn't warmed up quickly enough yet in this far north. But with a heating table, you can get everything started in the greenhouse without any artificial light quite early. So that's one of the next things that I'm working on, is to try and get that built from reclaimed materials in the greenhouse.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. And I know another plant that you were growing, which I was curious about, and I don't know if I'm saying this right. Is it Udo or Udo?
Udo.
Yeah. Can you tell us about that?
That's an amazing plant as well. And I read about that in Around the World in 80 Plants, Stephen Barstow's book. Plant has been grown. It's called a mountain asparagus. That's another one of its names, or Japanese spikenard. And basically in Japan, they've been it's been a mountain gathered plant for a long time. But in the 20s, in Japan, they started growing it in Tokyo underground in caves. And the reason why they do that is that the plant it's one of those plants that you have to build a relationship with. You have to understand how to use it, right? It's not a plant that travels well. It's a plant that you eat the shoots of when it's a young plant. It's a taste. I haven't actually tasted it yet, because it takes 3 years before you can actually harvest it properly. And this is the first year. I started from seed that I got when I went up to visit Stephen in November. I literally collected seeds in his garden and then stratified them over the winter in my basement. And I had almost given up on them. I was like, they're not going to. And then suddenly in the middle of the summer, they all started sprouting. But basically in Japan, what they do they press them, so to speak. They don't give them any light, and then they sort of stretch, and it's called blanching, where you take a little bit of the bitterness out of the plant by doing that, and that gives them like this really it's a asparagus tasting blanched plant. And Stephen uses this technique, which is used in England for other plants. I'm trying to remember. There's a lot of different plants. He uses it on Mitsuba. He uses it on dandelion. He's a really big proponent of eating dandelion. And also lovage, which is another plant that I'm also really fell in love with this year. It's just beautiful when you use it the right way. And basically, again, it's by forcing it, right? You put a bucket over it before the snow melts, before it starts to see any light, put a bucket over it. And when the bucket is actually lifted and you see a gap, then you can take the bucket off and you can cut the whole plant right down to the ground, right? And it'll rebound. And then if in the case of lovage, it's like eating a celery with a little bit more taste, like a more tasty celery, right? But most people use lovage in soup, which is sort of the traditional way. And my neighbor has lovage here, but he never knew how to use it. Thought it was a nice smelling plant, so I got a bunch of plants from him. But those two plants are both plants that you need to know how to use and that have huge potential. The nice thing about both of those plants, but let's focus on Udo, is that it grows in the shade. So it tolerates 30 degrees Celsius below, and it grows in the shade. So it's perfect. It's perfect for places like Norway where you have those conditions all over the place and you don't know what to do with them. So the north part of my house is going to become, hopefully, an Udo forest, where currently nothing hardly grows there. So it's all about finding the right plant for the right place and building up a relationship to it to the point where you know how to use it.
Mm-hmm. And one last plant I wanted to talk about was Ashitaba. I think you're growing that too.
I am, and I heard about that one also on one of your podcasts with John Glavis.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard about it. When I heard about it, I was like, I definitely have to try that plant. I didn't think it would have much chance, but it is mentioned in Stephen Barstow's book, and a picture of the sap, which is this fluorescent, almost green sap that comes out of the stalks of Ashitaba, which is called tomorrow's leaf also, because when you cut the branch off, by the next day, the myth goes that you'll see a new leaf. And I wouldn't say it's the next day, but at least in Norway, it's pretty quickly it starts producing a new leaf. But the amazing thing about Ashitaba is that it's an edible. How do you call it? It's both something you can use as a vegetable, and it's also a herb that you can use as medicine. So eat your medicine. You've probably heard that many times on the show, but I would say that that's absolutely true. If you have, in my case, I have stomach problems, and Ashitaba is one of those plants that are really good for people who have stomach problems. And it produces something called chalcones, I think that's the right way to pronounce it, which is a kind of an antioxidant that only Ashitaba produces, as far as I know. And I was looking at it a little bit earlier today, and that the plant has been around for hundreds of years, and the islands in Japan where the Ashitaba is originally grown, there's been scientific evidence to show that one of the reasons why people live to be really old on that planet, it's one of those hotspots in the world where people live to be much older than other places, is actually because of this plant. And I'm not like, I don't say, eat this plant and everything's, you save the world or anything, but
perfect.
No, it's not like that. But it definitely helps. And what I'm thinking now is, in my case, I'm thinking I'm going to start making, because I've grown so much of it now that I don't know what to do with it all. I can't eat enough of it. So I realized that you can make tea out of it. So now I'm going to have skullcap Ashitaba tea.
Oh, that sounds great. And I wonder if you could make tinctures of it.
I'm sure you could.
I know, that's an amazing plant. I had never heard of it until I met John Glavis, and then my seeds, that it didn't survive, so I'm going to have to get seeds of that plant and try again, because it's so medicinal and beneficial for the human body.
Yeah, absolutely. It's you can feel it, and also I'd say also in terms of which picture that I like the best that I've taken so far on my farm, it's definitely a close up of Ashitaba. It's just a beautiful, beautiful plant.
You have such a wide variety of plants that you're growing. Are there any plants that we didn't talk about that you'd like to share with listeners today?
I like mouse melon also. It's a really cute plant. It's one of those plants that kids really love because it looks like a watermelon, but it's only the size of a grape. And it's a perennial. So you can just, if you want to, you can. In fact, the tubers taste better than the melon, I found out. The melons taste fine, but they're like cucumbers. But that's another beautiful plant that I'm also connected to. Really easy to grow. You can grow it in your window if you don't have enough space. It is a greenhouse type of plant, though. I don't think it would grow very well outdoors in Norway.
And I think you got your greenhouse from someone who it was kind of a reused greenhouse.
Yeah, I could tell that story really quickly. That's part of the permaculture philosophy, which I totally adhere to, is to find the slow and that's the right word, tempered solution. Don't take too big of a step. And when I was looking around for some sort of greenhouse, I was thinking maybe 30 square meters. And I saw this greenhouse when I was driving to work, so I decided to go in and ask. I was like, where can I get one of these polytunnels, but not one this big? And he said, well, you can buy mine. You can buy this one. I was like, what? It's huge. He's like, yeah, but I'm a pensionist, so I'm finished. I can't grow anymore. So you can get it from me. And I got it for almost a giveaway price. And it was something in the back of my mind saying, it can't be, it's too good to be true, And then that whole permaculture, take it easy, don't take a big jump. I was like, this is a pretty big jump to get a 300 square meter greenhouse from nothing to 300 square meters. But I felt, it fit with some of the other principles in permaculture, like reuse and recycle and microclimates. And I was thinking, well, it's just too good to give up. But it took me one winter of working on the weekends and in my free time to deconstruct the thing, and then I moved it, actually transported it last spring, and then last summer I spent the summer erecting it with some help from some roofers and the neighbors. Then it was up on the 20th of May this year.
So that was a process.
Oh man, it was a big step. I was really not sure if it was, and I heard also this year some of my neighbors, like, we also weren't sure if that was a good move. And in retrospect, I would advise people to go for maybe a quarter that size or even less to start off with. I can't use the whole space. So just recently I've been talking with other people or growers in the area who don't have enough space, and saying, especially in the spring, I have way more space than I can use in the spring because the plants are so small.
Well, this has been so fun and fascinating to talk with you, Andrew. Is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you'd like to share with listeners?
No, I think I covered it. I mean, I guess if I was going to wrap it up, I would just say that I would recommend for people to just pick one plant and save seeds from it and share seeds until you kind of feel that it's a part of your family and that the plant doesn't feel lonely anymore. Slowly add more and more plants to your family until you've built an ecosystem of stability and health around you and your family. And, in the process to become more mindful of your actions and of your society, and it will become clear how important living life focused on living connections rather than material things is. We only have one earth and we need to take care of it.
If people want to learn more about your work and contact you, how can they find you online?
If you go to refugeegreenspace.org, you'll find me there. My contact information is there.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.